so many languages that reflect culture, tradition, and history of each nation are dying out each minute. We also see governments that are recognizing the importance of language, but wasting so much money on ineffective mechanisms that are not really preserving those languages. We on the affirmative team believe in the power of education. Education that creates generations of speakers that speak those languages. Education that creates further awareness that those languages are important, and that education that eventually will lead to the preservation of culture. The model that we're going to be standing by in this debate is as follows. We believe that nations that have indigenous peoples such as Australia, NZ, and United States should create schools that teach in indigenous and endangered languages. The Republic of Korea, although it's a great nation, does not fit in this debate. First of all, the standards of language that we are going to be talking about in this debate will be followed as the UNESCO designated standards. Those standards would be those endangered languages. We believe that UNESCO standards of entirely morbid languages, in which only one person that speaks those languages is alive, is not going to be part of this model. Secondly, we think that these schools should be teaching subjects that all other schools are teaching in the status quo. That includes numeracy, literacy, and creative thinking, but also official language of that nation as well. Thirdly, we believe that those schools should be left to the choices of individual students. So students who are belonging to the indigenous communities have a choice of whether they want to go to schools or whether they want to go to schools that are officially recognized by governments. But finally, we believe that the level of education and level of schools that we're going to be providing to you on the affirmative team would be government-provided minimum education. So for most nations, this would be primary schools that are using endangered indigenous languages. No thank you, sir. What we are going to be proving to you on the affirmative team is that cultural preservation is an important social objective and that education is an important mechanism of doing so. And we're going to prove this to you through 4 substantive points. I, as the Prime Minister, will be asking 3 simple questions. First of all, why are indigenous and endangered languages important? Secondly, why should government take responsibility in cultural preservation? And finally, why schools should be the method of doing so. My second speaker, Sanyang, will then move on to show you why minorities will be empowered through this policy. And this leads me nicely to my first substantive point. No thank you, sir. About why are indigenous and endangered languages important? We believe on the affirmative team that language is the basic reflection of all culture. History texts, cultural artifacts, and tradition all use the indigenous languages. We believe that those languages that are used as a means should be recognized and protected in order for that culture to be protected, ladies and gentlemen. If we don't protect the language itself, you are not protecting the entire culture because you're not protecting the medium through which that culture is exercised. We believe that in the status quo, in which rituals of Native Indians are protected, is a good example as to how the society recognizes that indigenous and endangered languages are important, because obviously Native Americans will not use English when they're conducting their native rituals. And this is the reason why we think the basic mechanism of protecting culture should be the protection of language. And we believe that this protection of language is critical, especially given that these are minorities. Yes?
The purpose of education is not to preserve culture but prepare our students for the real world. Teaching them indigenous languages prevents them from accessing a real society properly.
Not really, sir. First of all, we provide you a choice in which those students can go to normal schools that don't teach in such indigenous languages. But more importantly, we think that there are values in repairing culture, because those schools are teaching histories of such minority cultures as well. We believe in the affirmative team that such purpose is consistent with state policies in the status quo. And that's the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that language is the basic reflection of culture, Native and indigenous languages should be protected. We see this in the examples of Native Americans, in which Native Americans were forced to go to English-speaking schools, and there's a decrease of number of speakers, there's a decrease in number of diversity, there's a decrease in the number of traditions and cultural artifacts that are preserved right now. And that's the reason why we believe on the affirmative team that indigenous and endangered languages are important. But the second question, about why should the government take responsibility in cultural preservation? There are 2 reasons for this. The first, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that minority groups have been actively persecuted by governments before. We believe that ethnic minorities such as Aborigines of the United States, Navajo Native Americans of the United States of America have been actively persecuted through forced eviction, through discrimination, through cultural crackdown by the government. That's the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, the government should be the actor in saying that these languages and cultures that have been harmed by governments need to be protected. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the government was the actor that was complicit and actively participating in the harm of those cultures. we believe that the government needs to take crucial responsibility in doing so. A good example of this is in which African Americans have gone through years of persecution in the years of persecution in U.S. history, and now the United States government recognizes that those African Americans, because they were historically persecuted, need to be empowered through actions like equal employment, through actions like Hate Speech Act. Ladies and gentlemen, this we believe is consistent with the state responsibilities in the status quo. But the second reason as to why the government needs to take responsibility is because the government has the inherent value of representation. Government is there to represent all people. Government is there to mandate and to be mandated to represent all people. But before I want to show you why further there's a value of that minority representation, I'll take you sir.
If indigenous minorities who go to English-speaking schools don't learn their own language outside school, maybe it's a sign that this language is defunct and deserves to die.
Not really, sir. There are people who want to go to indigenous speaking schools, but they are not given the choice to go to them in the first place. That's why we think on the affirmative team we give that important choice, and that choice needs to be reflected. We believe that there are minorities that are ignored, and that inherent values of representation is not being achieved. Government is the only entity that has the manpower and the influence that it has in the status quo, and the government already recognizes that value of diversity. When we see the example of the New Zealand government protecting the Maasai tribe through active subsidies and through active subsidization of cultural artifacts, museums in the status quo. Because the government already recognizes this inherent value of representation, we believe on the affirmative team that the government has an interest in protecting the national identity and history that is a very important part of their culture. And therefore, for these two reasons, we believe on the affirmative team that governments need to be the actor that take active responsibility in cultural preservation. This leads me to my final about why schools should be the mechanism of protecting languages. We believe that languages are fundamentally different from other historical artifacts because languages cannot stand by themselves. Languages require speakers and writers. Languages are methods of interaction. We believe, therefore, education should be a crucial part of representation because the mechanisms that the government is employing in the status quo, such as subsidy, such as scholarly institutions, don't create speakers and writers. Education, therefore, needs to be a mechanism through which the government is creating those speakers and writers and therefore protecting language in the long term. The reason why we do this is because by having schools, we create generations of indigenous speakers that can contribute to society back because those people can speak and write in those languages. We also think that if schools are allowed, we believe that there will be scholarly institutions that are standardizing languages and making sure that those researches that are not sufficient in the status quo can be held. We think that this is fundamentally different from in the status quo in which schools are not existing and therefore those research institutions do not have any incentive to participate in that. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the government needs to take a crucial responsibility and that cultural preservation is a crucial value and a crucial social objective. If you believe that that is a crucial social